The houses on this side start above 2 million, the real estate host said, lowering his voice as if protecting me from embarrassment. You may be more comfortable looking across the highway. Two women from the neighborhood committee nodded. They assumed my plain coat and old address meant I could not afford Oakridge. I did not tell them that I owned 5 adjoining properties outside the window, nearly half the commercial block they used for coffee, flowers, books, and parking. My name is Vivian Brooks. I was 64, divorced, and the managing owner of Brooks Row Holdings. I had grown up 3 streets from Oakridge when the neighborhood was considered ordinary. My mother altered dresses above a pharmacy. My father drove a city bus. Wealth arrived slowly, through property nobody called prestigious when I bought it. The open house belonged to my niece Tessa's employer. Tessa worked for an interior design firm and had asked me to see the restored mansion because the company planned to rent it for an event. I arrived early, before she could meet me. The host assumed I was shopping for a home and redirected me. I could have corrected him with one sentence. Instead, I asked what made him think another area would be more comfortable. He mentioned maintenance costs and lending standards. The committee women studied my shoes. Their certainty interested me more than the insult. Tessa entered and introduced me as her aunt. The host relaxed, believing the misunderstanding had ended. One committee member said Oakridge had changed dramatically, and even long-time local families could no longer afford it. She intended sympathy. It still treated ownership as something that had happened only to newcomers. My first property was a narrow storefront with an apartment above it. I bought it at 31 after the owner retired. The roof leaked, the furnace served both floors, and the commercial tenant was a tailor who paid below market rent. The bank required a large down payment because the building looked risky. I lived upstairs for 7 years and kept the tailor's lease. My accounting job paid the mortgage when repairs exceeded rent. I learned commercial insurance, masonry, fire separation, and why one blocked roof drain could damage 3 floors. The building appreciated only after I had stopped expecting quick proof. The second property came through a tax sale, though television would have made that sound easier than it was. A vacant bakery owed taxes and needed environmental review because of an old fuel tank. I spent 9 months clearing title and another year remediating soil under professional supervision. I opened the bakery space to a tenant named Rosa Mendez, who had operated from a shared kitchen. Her first lease included stepped rent and clear repair responsibilities. She built a loyal business. I received reliable income instead of chasing a national tenant that wanted free improvements. Over 28 years, I acquired 3 more adjoining parcels. One held a bookstore, one held a flower shop with 2 apartments, and one was a small parking lot. Together, the 5 parcels occupied nearly half the block's frontage. I owned them through Brooks Row Holdings with no outside equity partners. The combined properties were valued near $12 million. Debt stood below $3 million. My retirement accounts and cash reserves added another layer of security. Yet commercial value remained tied to tenants, roofs, taxes, vacancies, and the city's decisions about land. The path between the first storefront and the 5th parcel contained years when nothing looked successful. A masonry repair consumed 1 full season of rent. The bakery remediation required reports I barely understood at first. I hired engineers, asked basic questions, and kept contingency funds instead of pretending confidence could replace expertise. Banks also treated each purchase differently. The first loan depended on my salary and personal guarantee. The third relied on stabilized rental income. By the 5th, lenders valued the connected frontage and tenant history. Access improved after the portfolio already existed, which made later growth appear easier than the beginning. I remembered that imbalance whenever someone praised my instinct. Timing and accumulated collateral opened doors that remained closed to capable first-time buyers. Work mattered, but a complete account also included credit, luck, policy, and the prices of an earlier decade. Rose's Bakery nearly failed during its second winter when a water main closed the sidewalk. I granted temporary percentage rent under a written amendment, not a handshake. Her recovery preserved a good tenant and taught me that flexibility worked best when expectations remained documented. The tailor in my first building eventually retired. I renovated his space and leased it to a bicycle repair shop rather than the highest-paying boutique applicant. The bicycle shop required less improvement money and served commuters using the new rail station. Financial value did not always arrive through the largest quoted rent. Those choices created the tenant mix Aldecrest later wanted to replace. I did not romanticize them. The bicycle shop once paid late, the flower shop disputed utility allocation, and bookstore deliveries blocked an alley. Local businesses were not automatically virtuous. They were relationships governed by ordinary contracts. Oakridge became fashionable after a rail station opened. Old houses were renovated, restaurants arrived, and prices accelerated. Some improvements were welcome. Sidewalks were repaired and vacant buildings filled. Other changes pushed long-time renters and businesses away. I did not freeze every rent. Property taxes doubled over a decade, insurance rose, and buildings required modern systems. I used longer leases, stepped increases, and renewal options so tenants could plan. Stability served them and protected me from expensive turnover. The neighborhood committee had no authority over my commercial properties, but it influenced events, parking, and public discussions. Its members often described the block as the village center while ignoring who owned or worked there. I attended meetings under my company name, usually represented by property manager Calvin Lee. After the open house, Tessa apologized for the host. I told her the insult belonged to him, not her. She asked why I had not revealed the block. I said property ownership was irrelevant to whether his assumption was reasonable. 2 days later, a development company named Aldecrest offered to buy all 5 parcels for $13,500,000. The offer required vacant delivery within 18 months. Existing leases would be bought out or allowed to expire. The buyer planned luxury retail, offices, and underground parking. The price exceeded the latest appraisal. Selling would remove debt, simplify retirement, and create enough cash to change my family's future. It would also end Rosa's bakery lease, the bookstore's renewal option, and 12 apartment tenancies unless the buyer preserved them voluntarily. I did not reject the offer immediately. Responsible decisions deserved analysis. My attorney reviewed lease rights. My accountant modeled taxes, reinvestment, and income. Calvin assessed upcoming capital work. I met each commercial tenant without disclosing confidential price terms and asked about 5-year plans. The bookstore owner wanted to retire within 4 years. Rosa hoped her daughter would take over the bakery. The flower shop had invested in refrigeration and needed at least 6 more years. Apartment tenants wanted predictable renewals, not promises that rent would never change. I countered with a structure that preserved current leases and required replacement retail during construction. Aldecrest declined. Its project depended on clearing the site and combining parcels. The company increased the offer to $14,200,000 with the same vacancy condition. Rumors reached the neighborhood committee. Members feared a large development, but also wanted more parking and higher-end stores. They scheduled a public forum. The real estate host from the open house attended as a committee advisor. Calvin planned to represent Brooks Row. I decided to attend personally because the sale question now affected public claims about my properties. Tessa came as an observer, not my spokesperson. The host opened by describing absentee commercial owners who might sell the neighborhood's character. Then he saw me in the second row and offered directions to the resident seating area. I said I was seated correctly as the owner of Brooks Row Holdings. He looked at the 5 highlighted parcels on the projected map. "You own all of those?" "Yes," I said. The bakery through the parking lot. The committee women from the open house recognized me. One whispered that it was half the block. The phrase traveled through the room faster than the actual agenda. I disclosed the purchase offer without naming confidential terms. I explained that the proposal required vacancy and that no agreement had been signed. I also said keeping the property's required roof, electrical, accessibility, and drainage investments approaching $1 million over 5 years. Some residents praised me for protecting local stores before I had promised to reject the sale. Others accused me of using community sentiment to increase my price. I corrected both claims. Ownership gave me the decision, but tenants had legal rights and the neighborhood faced consequences. The answer needed more than applause. Rosa spoke about her lease and employees. The bookstore owner described retirement plans. An apartment tenant asked whether preservation meant future rent increases. I said our existing formula would continue, with written caps and hardship review for qualified residents. Preservation was not free housing or permanent commercial subsidy. The developer's representative explained that new construction would add tax revenue and accessible space. Those benefits were real. The plan also relied on displacement. Treating either side as entirely dishonest would make the decision easier and less accurate. The committee requested a 90-day planning period. I agreed not to sign a sale during that time. Aldercrest's offer remained open for 45 days, so the delay risked losing it. I accepted that risk without demanding the community reward me. We formed a working group with tenants, city staff, preservation advisors, and an independent architect. The goal was not to design my property for free. It was to determine whether phased improvements could address safety, access, parking, and business continuity. The architect found that 2 rear additions had little historic value and could be rebuilt. A shared service corridor could improve deliveries. The parking lot could support a modest mixed-use building without demolishing the storefront row, provided zoning allowed reduced parking ratios near transit. The alternative cost more than routine repairs and less than full redevelopment. It added 8 apartments, 2 accessible retail spaces, and underground utility work. Financing required a construction loan, tax credits for qualified rehabilitation, and long leases from existing businesses. Rosa's Bakery could move temporarily into the rebuilt corner, while its original space received plumbing upgrades. The bookstore could remain until the owner retired, then shift into a smaller storefront. The flower shop would keep its location with new electrical capacity. The plan was not a perfect preservation story. Construction would create noise. 1 tenant parking lot would close, and new apartments would rent higher than existing units. 2 rear garages would be removed. I documented those costs instead of calling every change community benefit. Aldercrest declined to participate but extended a smaller offer for only the parking lot. Selling that parcel would have removed the easiest location for new housing and left delivery problems unresolved. I declined. The committee then asked me to donate an easement for public seating. I offered a long-term license with maintenance responsibilities rather than permanent donation. Public benefit did not require pretending private land had no value. The city accepted the structure. Financing took 11 months. Interest rates rose, increasing projected debt service. I reduced the project size from 10 new apartments to 8 and contributed additional equity. Commercial tenants signed extensions only after reviewing construction protections with their own attorneys. The real estate host approached me after a planning meeting. He apologized for saying I could not afford Oakridge. Then he said my success proved anyone could buy if they worked hard enough. I rejected that lesson. I had benefited from stable employment, a bank willing to finance a difficult first building, timing before major appreciation, and Rosa's early tenancy. I had also worked and taken risk. Turning one outcome into a universal promise would ignore changed prices and unequal access. He asked whether I wanted to list the property someday. I said any future representation would require a competitive process. An apology did not create a business entitlement. Tessa worried that I was too hard on him. I said forgiveness could be personal while contracts remain professional. She understood after comparing it with vendors her design firm selected through bids. Construction began with utility relocation. Crews discovered an undocumented clay drain crossing 2 parcels. Replacing it added $120,000. The contingency covered most of the cost, and I added the remainder rather than reducing tenant protections. The bakery operated from a temporary kitchen for 6 weeks longer than planned. Its lease provided a rent abatement and moving allowance. We paid both automatically. Rosa still lost some walk-in business, and she said so publicly. A contract could reduce harm without erasing it. The bookstore remained open behind covered walkways. The owner used the disruption to begin retirement sales. When she closed 2 years later, employees received notice, and the shop donated archives to a local library. I did not portray the closure as a landlord victory. 8 apartments opened above the rebuilt corner. 2 had income-restricted rents under the financing program. The others rented at current market levels. Existing apartments kept their separate renewal formula. Clear categories prevented one promise from becoming misleading across different units. The new service corridor reduced delivery trucks blocking the street. Public seating opened near the bakery. The flower shop's refrigeration became more efficient. The project improved the block, though loan payments also increased and my cash distributions fell for several years. The first winter after opening exposed a design mistake. Wind pushed rain beneath one entrance canopy, creating a slippery patch. The architect argued that the detail met specifications. Meeting a drawing did not make the entrance safe. We installed a deeper gutter and heated mat while responsibility was reviewed. The final cost was divided between the architect's insurer, the contractor, and Brooks Rowe. I funded the temporary measures immediately rather than waiting for fault to settle. Liability discussions could continue after people stopped slipping. One of the income-restricted apartments remained vacant longer because its application process confused prospective tenants. The management company had copied language from a larger program. We worked with the housing agency to create a plain checklist and community information session. The unit leased the following month. The delay reminded me that affordability written into financing did not guarantee accessibility in practice. Rules could protect a benefit and still become a barrier when communication failed. New market-rate tenants complained that older residents paid less for similar space. We explained that leases began at different times under different programs. No tenant's private amount was disclosed. Fairness did not require erasing history or raising everyone to the newest price. The apartment committee requested bicycle storage, while merchants needed delivery space. The architect converted part of a rear utility room and added exterior racks without reducing service access. A conflict that sounded like competing values became a layout problem once people examined the site. Rose's daughter took over bakery operations in the third year. The lease required financial review and training because succession was not automatic. Rosa remained a guarantor for 12 months. Family continuity became a business transition supported by evidence, not sentiment alone. The flower shop renewed for 7 years after the electrical upgrade. Its owner accepted stepped rent in exchange for predictable limits and an option on a smaller storage room. The lease gave Brooks Rowe financeable income and gave the tenant planning stability. When the bookstore closed, national chains expressed interest. I selected a cooperative stationery and reading shop whose credit was weaker, but improvement needs were modest. The lease included a larger deposit, mentoring support from a small business center, and shorter initial term. That decision carried risk and was not charity. A vacant storefront would have reduced traffic for neighboring businesses. The cooperative's events supported the block, while safeguards limited exposure. Social and financial reasons could exist together without disguising either. The neighborhood committee opposed one evening event because visitors might use residential streets. The shop added reservations, transit information, and closing times. We monitored 3 events. Complaints remained low, so the committee withdrew its objection. I learned to require measurement before permanent rules. Predictions often reflected whose inconvenience received attention. A trial period with clear thresholds could produce better decisions than either instant permission or categorical refusal. Brooks Rowe's annual report included debt coverage, reserves, major repairs, commercial occupancy, and apartment turnover. Tenants did not receive investor returns, but they saw the information behind planned projects. Transparency had boundaries and still carried substance. My accountant warned that the preservation plan concentrated more of my wealth in one block. I increased liquid reserves and sold an unrelated warehouse interest. Loving a place did not eliminate portfolio risk. Protecting the block required ensuring one setback would not force a hurried sale. I also created a succession committee with an independent trustee, Calvin, and my niece Tessa as a non-voting family observer. Tessa could learn without gaining immediate control. Any future sale would require tenant notices, lease review, and professional valuation. The committee did not prohibit sale. Circumstances could change, and heirs should not be trapped by my preferences. It required a process that made consequences visible before signatures became irreversible. At a family meeting, I explained that the block's value did not equal cash waiting for distribution. Debt, taxes, leases, and capital obligations traveled with it. Several relatives lost interest once ownership sounded like work instead of a surprise inheritance. That response did not offend me. Wealth should not assign jobs to people who did not want them. Clear planning could convert property into options without pretending every family member shared my attachment to Oakridge. Family members learned about the original offer and asked why I had declined more than $14 million. Some called the decision generous. Others called it foolish. I described it as an investment choice that balanced return, control, taxes, tenants, and legacy. Moral praise simplified it too much. My wealth remained substantial. The completed project raised property value, though higher debt offset part of the gain. I could have sold and become more liquid. I chose continued responsibility because the alternative plan was financially workable and better aligned with what I wanted to manage. The neighborhood committee changed its membership rules after the forum. Commercial tenants and employees received seats, not only homeowners. Calvin joined for one term. I declined a permanent position because owning half the block already gave me more influence than most participants. Tessa later rented one of the new apartments at the published rate after her firm relocated nearby. An independent manager handled the application. I offered no family discount and did not access her file. She appreciated that the building did not become an extension of our relationship. At another open house, the same host introduced me accurately as a local property owner. I asked him also to introduce Rosa as the bakery owner rather than my tenant. Ownership language shapes whose work appears central. I still lived outside Oakridge in a condominium purchased after my divorce. It was comfortable and less expensive than the mansions. I could afford the neighborhood. I did not need to buy a residence there to validate the statement. The condominium also diversified my daily life from the block. I could leave work behind, walk to a different grocery store, and know neighbors who had no reason to discuss leases. Living elsewhere prevented ownership from consuming every relationship. Tessa once asked whether I regretted not buying an Oak Ridge mansion before prices climbed. I had considered one and declined because its maintenance and taxes exceeded what I wanted. An opportunity to display appreciation was not the same as a lost life goal. I used part of the block's income to fund scholarships for local bookkeeping and building trades programs. The grants were administered by an independent foundation. Tenants received no preference, and relatives could not apply through me. Good intentions still needed boundaries. Rose's granddaughter later received one scholarship through an open review. I learned after selection. The separation protected her achievement from becoming a favor and protected the program from becoming my personal circle of gratitude. The real estate host eventually invited me to speak about neighborhood history. I agreed only if longtime tenants and a housing researcher joined. My ownership story could add one perspective, not replace the experiences of people who had been priced out. The 5 parcels were not half the block by land area after new construction, but they remained nearly half the frontage. People continued using the phrase because it was memorable. I used exact parcel descriptions and contracts and allowed the family shorthand at dinner. Every spring, I physically walked the entire frontage with Calvin and one tenant representative. We noted masonry, drainage, lighting, delivery conflicts, and trees before preparing the capital plan. The ritual kept appreciation connected to physical work. A block worth millions could still be damaged by one ignored leak. Quiet ownership still required muddy shoes. They said I could not afford their neighborhood because appearance made a fast story. Revealing that I owned half the block changed their estimate of me, but ownership was only the beginning. The harder work was deciding whether to sell, preserve, build, borrow, and listen without surrendering responsibility. Wealth gave me choices. Accountability required admitting who would live with each one.